Assalamualaikum Warahmatullahi Wabarakatuh. My name is Nursafitri Siraif. My official number is A1M219058. I will bring material about history of language testing. In any history of testing, the Chinese imperial examinations naturally come first, as this was the first statewide effort to establish a testing system under centralized control. The Chinese principle, as Lord Macaulay called it when arguing in the British Parliament for its adoption as a method of selecting cadets for the Indian Civil Service, involved a long and complex academic examination intended to test and rank a number of well-prepared candidates. It had no interest in evaluating or influencing an educational system, but its only concern was sorting and selecting a tiny and entirely independent elite. While the imperial examinations faded away even before the last of the emperors, they had a major effect in establishing a very strong and eventually unhealthy respect for testing in China and other countries under Chinese influence, producing continued pressure on education in Japan and Korea as well as China. This first major examination may well be contrasted with the medieval Treviso test, in which the students of the Northern Italian school were assessed at the end of the year by a representative of the city council, which then paid the schoolmaster according to the success of his students. Aris 1962, Meadows 1990. The important characteristic of this approach were its focus on the educational process, its use of the school curriculum as specification of content, and its interest in ranking pupils only in terms of their mastery of the curriculum. When in the 16th century, the Jesuits brought the Chinese notion of examination to Europe, they adapted it to the Treviso purpose of the control of the curriculum. In the classical Christian schools of the 17th and 18th century, pupils were tested at regular intervals on their mastery of the curriculum, and their progress was determined by the success on the regular test. In England, the 19th century, there were important new developments. Macaulay, 1853-1898, argued in Parliament for the examination that were adopted initially for the Indian and later for the English civil service. They were partially modeled on examinations at Oxford and Cambridge, the goal of which was to rank a comparatively small number of well-prepared candidates. At Oxford, those who did well received first, second, or third-class honors, and at Cambridge, the best student in the tripos was called senior wrangler. A similar model was adopted in 19th century Prussia in the selection of magistrates. In England and the colonies, the popular esteem in which examinations were held made it possible toward the end of the century to widen the system. Examinations were commonly conducted by the school inspectors to assess the achievement of pupils in state elementary schools. In the early years of the 20th century, there was an effort to extend the school-based testing by the use of the objective techniques being developed by the new field of psychometrics. In England, the interest was short-lived, birthed in 1921, but revived in 1944 with the 11+ examination intended to decide what kind of secondary school pupils should go to. The American oral objective test, initially true or false, but later increasingly multiple choice, came to be seen as the ideal instrument for most assessment purposes. Occasionally adopted elsewhere, it met resistance in much of the world until the full forces of globalization after the Second World War led to its rapid proliferation and current virtual universalization. It is now associated with a movement for accountability in education, with many systems accepting the Treviso principle that teachers should be paid according to their pupils' test results. The early test often included components intended to assess language competence, where the emphasis was on literacy skills. The method was generally to require composition or translation, and later, as these do not lend themselves to objective testing, comprehension, which can be tested with multiple choice items. For many language testers of Bernard Spolsky's generation, this story starts in the 1960s, the beginning of the large-scale industrialization and centralization of language testing that has come to be based in Princeton and Cambridge. Berners-Polski's 1977 view of this point in time was a progression from a traditional examination consisting of written translation, composition, comprehension, and grammar, through a psychometrically driven testing of structural linguistic items that had formed the basis of such tests as the Michigan Ladder Test of English, LADO 1951. In the next stage, there appeared a new trend that combined John Carroll's argument for integrative testing, Carroll 1961, with the experience of the FSI oral examination, all modified in the light of Cooper's argument for adding sociolinguistic aspects, Cooper 1968. Looking back over the half century during which language assessment have developed into an identifiable academic field as well as a major industry, there are several trends which are worth identifying. One particularly relevant to the academic field but with strong influence on practical test development has been the effort to overcome what was recognized 100 years ago as the avoidable uncertainty of examinations, Edgeworth 1888. The last 50 years have seen much more robust and intelligent efforts to establish validity. The notion of validity was greatly broadened by the work of Lyle Beckman, 1990-2000, who applied to language testing the extended definition of validity proposed by Masick, 1980-1989, which included focus on impact. The pursuit of validity continues. Beckman has now found ways to integrate the social implications and the use of language test results into the model, and whose work is central to test revision at Cambridge. A second major trend has been the complications involved in what Carroll called integrative testing, the assessment of samples of language, written or spoken, produced by the candidates and hardly susceptible to objective measurement by requiring human judgment. Language testers in the 1930s and 1940s wanted to test these performances but were challenged by the psychometric difficulties of establishing reliability on the one hand and in determining which factors led to individual judgments on the other. Perhaps the most significant development from the non-industrial oral testing process was the growth of the importance of the scale. For Thorndike, in the early days of testing, a scale consisted of a number of prejudged and carefully ranked examples of the product being scaled. Handwriting or essays, Thorndike, 1910. For the Foreign Service Institute, a scale was a verbal protocol describing as accurately as possible the particular characteristics of a language performance of a defined level or stage of learning. Johnson, 1979. Such scales work as mnemonics for trained judges to remind them of the consensus they had reached in training exercises and in previous experience. They raise all sorts of integrating theoretical problems. They assume, for instance, that language proficiency is scalable rather than a set of partially related abilities in performing various language functions. As a result, they need to be accepted by consensus rather than validated in practice or theory. Besides, what may be called the psychometric, industrial, and scaling trends, an important development in the late 20th century language testing was the broadening of the content to include sociolinguistically influenced aspects of language. One inevitable conclusion has been the realization that tests need to find some way to achieve authenticity and to measure the ability to perform in situations not unlike the real world. There has been another important adjustment of language testing to its social context, and this has been the attempt to define and even judge the social context of test use and the ethnicality of the test. The concern over social and educational effects of tests was not new. Latham, 1877, complained that examinations at the end of the 19th century were leading to narrowing of educational goals. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you for your kind attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.